Hey, and welcome back to my series Portable Magic, where I'm reading my favorite books. This will be part 2 from the book Still Life with Woodpecker by Tom Robbins. Last week we ended on chapter 8, and during those chapters we learned about the royal family, the Furstenberg Barcelonas, who have been exiled, King Max and Queen Tilly and Princess Lee Cherie, and they're living in exile on the Puget Sound. It would really help my channel so much if you would hit that like button and the notification bell. Starting with chapter 9. Thank you so much. And here we go. Sandwiches were invented by the Earl of Sandwich. Popcorn was invented by the Earl of Popcorn. And salad dressing by the oil of vinegar. The moon invented natural rhythm. Civilization uninvented it. Princess Lee Cherie would have liked to reinvent it. But at that point, she hadn't a clue. She had ovened that rubber cookie called the diaphragm and gotten pregnant anyway. Many women do. She had played hostess to that squiggly, metallic houseguest who goes by his initials IUD and suffered cramps and infections. Many women do. She had, in desperation against her fundamental instincts, popped the pill. She became ill physically and emotionally. Many women do. She had experimented with the jellies and jams, creams and goops, sprays and suppositories, powders and foams, gels and gunks, only to discover her romantic personality. She had grown up with European folk tales, one tale at any rate, repulsed by the technological textures, industrial odors, and napalm flavors. Most romantic personalities are. This constant battle with the reproductive process, a war in which her only allies were pharmaceutical robots, alien agents whose artificial assistance seemed more treacherous than trustworthy, was gnawing with plastic teeth at her very concepts of love. Was it entirely paranoid to suspect that all those stoppers, thingamajigs, and substances devised to prevent conception were intended not to liberate womankind from the biological and social penalties imposed on her natural passions, but rather, at the insidious design of capitalistic Puritans, were supposed to technologize sex, to dilute its dark juices, to contain its wilder fires, to censor its sweet nastiness, to scrub it clean, clean as a laboratory autoclave, clean as a hospital bed, to order it uniform, to render it safe, to eliminate the risk of uncontrollable feelings, illogical commitments, and deep involvements, substituting for those risks the less mysterious, tamer risks of infection, hemorrhage, cancer, and hormone imbalance. Yes, to make sexual love so secure and sane and sanitary, so slick and frolicsome, so casual that it is not a manifestation of love at all, but a near anonymous, near autonomous, hedonistic scratching of a bunny itch, an itch far removed from any direct relation to the feverish enigmas of life and death, and a scratching programmed so that it would in no way interfere with the real purpose of human beings in a capitalistic, puritanical society, which is to produce goods and consume them. Since she could not possibly answer that question, she couldn't even ask it without getting winded. And since the lunch hour parking lot rendezvous in the back of her boyfriend's van were frankly deficient in certain romantic details that she'd always associated with sex, the princess decided that she would enter a second exile, celibacy. Before she could steal safely across the border, however, the biological IRS caught up with her and exacted its stubborn price. Chapter 10. When her lover, the quarterback, implored her to have her pregnancy taken care of, Princess Lee Cherie rested her forehead against the plate glass of the vegetarian restaurant in which they were dining and wept. No, she said, No, no, no. At 19, she had already undergone one abortion. She would not tolerate a second. No, she said. A teardrop hung out of each blue eye, like a fat woman leaning out of a tenement window. They bobbed, balanced, and bobbed again, as if dreading the uncertain journey down her cheeks. Wavering there, her teardrops reflected for a moment the sheen of the soybean curd upon her plate. No more vacuum cleaners, no more steel. They can scrape my heart, they can scrape my brain, before they'll scrape my uterus again. It's been over a year since my last DNC, and I still feel raw in there. It feels bitter when it should feel sweet. It feels ragged when it should feel smooth. It feels deep purple when it should feel pink. Death has thrown a stag party in the most sacred room in my body. From now on, that space belongs to life. Any time that technology subverts a benevolent natural process, the sensitive smell sulfur. For Princess Lee Cherie, abortions had not only the reek of totalitarianism, but the shriek of betrayed meat. If another DNC was an intolerable idea, however, the prospect of inopportune maternity was equally distressing, and not just for the usual reasons. Furstenberg, Barcelona was an ancient lineage in which strict codes had evolved. If a female member of the family wished to possess full privilege, if she would someday be queen, then she must neither marry nor mother before the age of 21, nor could she, before that age, forsake her parents' domicile. And although she considered herself one of the people, Lee Cherie did very much indeed desire full royal privilege. Lee Cherie believed that she could use that privilege to help the world. Fairy tales and myths are dominated by accounts of rescued princesses, she reasoned. Isn't it about time that a princess returned the favor? Lee Cherie had a vision of the princess as hero. As Queen Tilly put it when Max asked her what she thought their only daughter wanted out of life, "She wants to buy the world a Coke." What? "She wants to buy the world a Coke." Well, said Max, she can't afford it, and the world would demand Diet Pepsi anyhow. Why doesn't she buy me a martini instead? Chapter 11. It was autumn, the springtime of death. Rain spattered the rotting leaves, and the wind wailed. Death was singing in the shower. Death was happy to be alive. The fetus bailed out without a parachute. It landed in the sideline astroturf, so upsetting the cheerleaders that for the remainder of the afternoon their rahs were little more than squeaks. The Huskies won anyway, knocking off favored UCLA 28-21. And at nearby University Hospital, where Lee Cherie had to have a pint of common blood pumped into her royal conduits, the interns were in a festive mood. Lee Cherie's dilemma was resolved, for the time being, but she felt like a black candle at a wake for a snake. When an intern whistled "Proud Mary," she had no inclination to sing along. Her boyfriend telephoned about 8 that evening. He was at his fraternity house. They were having a victory party. He said he'd drop by the hospital the next day, but he must have lost the address. When her identity was learned, the princess was moved to a private room. She was given the best sedative in the house, Chateau du Phenobarbital, 1979. Asleep at last, she dreamed of the fetus. In her dream, the fetus went toddling off down some awkward dirt road like Charlie Chaplin at the end of a silent movie. By Tuesday, she was physically recovered to the degree that she could return to campus, where she learned that her status as the only genuine princess west of New York was insufficient to deflect the moral indignation of the Committee on Cheerleaders. Asked to resign from the Yell Squad, She resigned from classes as well. She also resigned from men, but rather late to appease the king and queen. Max's heart was rattling like a full set of dishes when he told Lee Cherie that she must shape up or ship out. "We've been liberal with you," said Max, "because, well, after all, this is America." Max neglected to point out that it was also the last quarter of the 20th century. But that, no doubt, was self-evident. Adolf Hitler was a vegetarian, Queen Tilly reminded Lee Cherie for the 300th time. Tilly was attempting to discourage her daughter from joining a natural foods commune in Hawaii, an option that appeared to be open to her if she elected to relinquish royal privilege. In turn, Lee Cherie might have reminded the Queen that Hitler ate 2 pounds of chocolate a day, but she'd grown weary of that dietary debate. Besides, she'd decided to protect her claim on royal privilege, even though it meant subjecting herself to tighter social restrictions. "You gonna be a good girl then?" "Yes, mother." "If we deal you a new hand, will you play by the rules?" "Yes, father." They observed her as she turned to go upstairs. They observed her as if it were the first time they'd really looked upon her in years. Despite her pale color and the unhappiness that clung to her the way a bad dream clings to a rumpled pillowcase, she was lovely. Her hair, as straight and red as ironed ketchup, rode gravity's one-way ticket all the way to her waist. Her blue eyes were as soft and moist as huevos rancheros, and the long curl of her lashes caused fimbriate shadows to fall on the swell of her cheeks. She was not tall, yet the legs that hung out of her skirt seemed a tall woman's leg, and beneath her "No Nukes is Good Nukes" t-shirt, her astonishingly round breasts jiggled ever so slightly, like balls balanced on the noses of Valium-eating seals. Tilly stroked her chihuahua. Max's heart made a sound like the sleigh bells on Mrs. Santa Claus's dildo. Chapter 12. Neoteny. Neoteny. Oh, how the Remington SL3 enjoys that word! Unrestrained, it would fill the page with neoteny, 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 neoteny. Of course, it bothers the Remington SL3 not a comma's worth that very few readers know what the word means. Given an opportunity to write it again, however, the machine would be inclined toward definition. Neoteny is remaining young, and it may be ironic that it is so little known because human evolution has been dominated by it. Humans have evolved to their relatively high state by retaining the immature characteristics of their ancestors. Humans are the most advanced of mammals, although a case could be made for the dolphins, because they seldom grow up. Behavioral traits such as curiosity about the world, flexibility of response, and playfulness are common to practically all young mammals, but are usually rapidly lost with the onset of maturity in all but humans. Humanity has advanced. When it has advanced, not because it has been sober, responsible, and cautious, but because it has been playful, rebellious, and immature. One needn't feel excessively ignorant if one was unfamiliar with neoteny. There have been queens and kings and princesses who also were oblivious to it, in word and in action. During the period following Lee Cherie's miscarriage, the supposed virtue of maturity was cardinal in the Puget Sound Palace. Although understandably vague about what maturity might actually be, Lee Cherie strove, with her parents' encouragement, to acquire more of it. Nightly, until the age of 15, and on a few evenings thereafter, she had been told a bedtime story. Until a few weeks prior, she had been flailing about paroxysmally amidst pom-poms. shouting incomprehensible incantations meant to further the fortunes of a band of innocent sprites worshipping a sacred fruit. Upon the fortunes of that same football team habitually rode much of mature King Max's bank account. But that's another matter. It was about time she grew up. Princesses were not exactly a dime a dozen, and this princess, it had suddenly dawned upon Tilly and Max, was a sexpot. She might be expected, upon attaining the age of 21, to marry well, very well indeed. In fact, there was probably no man, from Prince Charles to the U.S. President's son, whom she might not fairly mate. Those prospects pleased the king and queen. Heretofore, living under the stare of the CIA, having agreed to retire from the royalty circuit, the Furstenberg Barcelonas sheltered no particular ambitions for their daughter and were content to have her indulge a normal American girlhood, although they were unconvinced that developments such as vegetarianism and ecology were normal. Now it occurred to them that if this young woman were to attract the attention of the right man, one of the emerging Arab rulers, for example, even the CIA probably would be powerless to prevent a most propitious union. It was the wrong time to speak of marriage to Lee Cherie. Lee Cherie had driven a wooden stake through the Valentine. Yet, on the premise that it would aid preparation for her mission in life, on the premise that were she ever to resume her studies in environmental sciences, she might not be so easily distracted by vibrations from the half shellfish, half peach that occupied the warm, watery bowl of her lower regions. She made herself available to maturation, if maturation would have her. Put away was her teddy bear. Put away were her Beach Boys records. Put away was her fantasy of a Hawaiian honeymoon with Ralph Nader, her daydream of Ralph and her driving off together into the Haleakala sunset with their seatbelts fastened. Not that she changed her mind about how perfect she'd be for him. He worked too hard, smiled too little, and dined as one indifferent to both flavor and fate. He clearly was a hero in need of rescue by a princess. It was just that romantic fantasies were immature. Lee Cherie read books on solar radiation. She perused papers on overpopulation. To keep abreast of current events, she watched every news telecast that she could, fleeing the TV room immediately whenever a love story was dramatized. She gave her ears to Mozart and Vivaldi. Tchaikovsky was too painful. She fed flies to Prince Charming, and she worked at keeping her person and her room exceedingly clean. Cleanliness is next to godliness, was one slogan of maturity, to which Lee Cherie could faithfully subscribe, not stopping to consider that if by the last quarter of the 20th century godliness wasn't next to something more interesting than cleanliness, it might be time to reevaluate our notions of godliness. Chapter 13. Giulietta didn't work on Sundays. It was only fair. Even Friday got Thursday off, thanks to Robinson Crusoe. On Sundays, Queen Tilly would lumber into the kitchen, her chihuahua affectionately clasped, and make brunch. The odor of frying bacon, sausage links, and ham tiptoed on little pig feet all the way to the north end of the second floor. Inevitably, the odor would awaken Lee Cherie. Inevitably, the odor made her simultaneously ravenous and nauseated. She hated the sensation. It reminded her of pregnancy. Every Sunday morning, celibacy notwithstanding, Lee Cherie awoke to a pan of fried fear. Even after the panic had subsided, she found little to admire about a Sunday. To her mind, Sunday was where God kept his woolly slippers. It was a day with a dull edge that no amount of recreation can hone. Some might find it relaxing, but the princess guessed that a great many people shared her feeling that Sunday generated a supernatural depression. Sunday, a wan, stiff shadow of robust Saturday. Sunday, the day divorced fathers with visitation rights take their children to the zoo. Sunday, forced leisure for folks who have no aptitude for leisure. Sunday, when the hangover knows no bounds. Sunday, the day the boyfriend didn't come to the hospital. Sunday, an overfed white cat mewing hymns and farting footballs. The day of the full moon, when the moon is neither increasing nor decreasing, the Babylonians called Sabbat, meaning heart rest. It was believed that on this day, the woman in the moon, Ishtar, as the moon goddess was known in Babylon, was menstruating. For in Babylon, as in virtually every ancient and primitive society, there had been since the earliest times a taboo against women working, preparing food, or traveling when she was passing her monthly blood. On Sabbat, from which comes our Sabbath, men as well as women were commanded to rest. For when the moon menstruated, the taboo was on everyone. Originally, and naturally, observed once a month, the Sabbath was later to be incorporated by the Christians into their creation myth and made conveniently weekly. So nowadays, hard-minded men with hard muscles and hard hats are relieved from their jobs on Sundays because of an archetypal psychological response to menstruation. How Lee Cherie might have chuckled had she known that. On a particular Sunday in early January, January being to the year rather what Sunday is to the week, she wasn't aware of it, however, and she awoke in mean spirits. She pulled on a robe over her flannel pajamas. She'd discovered that silk had a tendency to agitate the peach fish, brushed the knots out of her hair, knuckled the crunchy granola from the corners of her eyes, and descended, yawning and stretching, into the hot hog hell of brunch. She knew without tasting that her soybean curd would have soaked up some of the essence of bacon. As it has for so many, for so long, the Sunday paper helped her through the day. Regardless of what else the press may have contributed to our culture, regardless of whether it is our first defense against totalitarianism or a wimpy force that undermines authentic experiences by categorizing them according to faddish popular interest, the press has given us big fat Sunday papers to ease our weekly mental menstrual bloat. Princess Lee Cherie, wriggle into your cheerleader uniform one last time and show us the way to hurrah. 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? The Sunday papers, the Sunday papers. Yeah! It was in the Seattle paper on that particular Sunday in early January that Lee Cherie initially read of the Geotherapy Care Fest, the What to Do for the Planet Until the 21st Century Arrives conference. It was an event that would have speeded up her pulse even had it not been scheduled to occur in Hawaii. As it was, she bounced in her mother's lap, hardly the ultimate mature act, for the first time in years, and began her petition to attend. For under the Furstenberg Barcelona Code, to which they now strictly adhered, the Queen would have to accompany her. Tilly on Maui? Uh-oh, spaghetti-o. Chapter 14. This may be said for the last quarter of the 20th century. The truism that if we want a better world, we will have to be better people came to be acknowledged, if not thoroughly understood, by a significantly large minority. Despite the boredom and anxiety of the period, or because of it, Despite the uneasy seas that separated the sexes, or because of them, thousands, tens of thousands, seemed willing to lend their bodies, their monies, and their skills to various planetary rescue missions. Coordination of those far-flung projects was a primary aim of the Geotherapy Care Fest, slated for the last week in February in Lahaina, Maui, Hawaii. Leading experts in the fields of alternative energy sources, organic farming, wilderness preservation, alternative education, holistic medicine, nutrition, consumer protection, recycling, and space colonization were to lecture and lead panel discussions and workshops. Proponents of many diverse self-help systems and consciousness cures, ranging from ancient Oriental to contemporary Californian, would also be in attendance. Moreover, certain futurists, artists, visionary thinkers, shamans, and poetic seers had been invited to participate, although several of the poets and one of the novelists were suspected by the organizers to register on the lunatic scale. Don't think the news of that conference didn't melt the ice off the dog dish at 30 paces. If her lifespan were a salad, Lee Cherie would have dived into the dressing to present that conference with a perfect crouton. Not the least of her excitement was the information that Ralph Nader would deliver a key speech there, and that one whole evening would be devoted to the subject of alternative methods of birth control. Even in the Siberia of celibacy, Lee Cherie was concerned with contraception. The problems associated with it had been more frustrating to her than the aggressive, competitive, assertive, egocentric, and crude behavior of the men with whom those problems should have been shared. And although she was presently free of the problem, she was too intelligent to mistake flight for victory. The king and queen hadn't seen their daughter so animated in months. True, this animation was a relative thing. Lee Cherie moved about like a zombie. Yet a few days earlier, she had more closely resembled a corpse. That was progress. Now there were moments when, speculating about the Care Fest, she actually appeared on the verge of smiling. What would any compassionate parents do? Give in, of course. Allow her her conference. As the date approached, Queen Tilly decided that Maui was simply too barbarous. It was bad enough being stuck on the outskirts of Seattle, it raining trout teeth night and day, blackberry vines trying to force their way into the privacy of her own chamber, without transporting her posh poundage to some jungle island inhabited by surfer boys and vacationing strumpets, to whose company on that particular week would be added a couple thousand cuckoos intent on saving a world they didn't fit into anyway. The Seattle Opera Company was opening Norma with Evie Stignani that same week, and although Stignani was well past her prime, she provided true legato, a rare commodity in those jagged times, and the Queen had been invited to be honorary hostess at a reception for the aging soprano. Since Max dare not travel because of his valve, it was agreed about the middle of February that Giulietta would chaperone the princess in Hawaii. Giulietta was antique and couldn't mouth 10 words of English, but she was so generally competent and so fond of Lee Cherie that Max and Tilly were convinced that her chaperonage would be adequate. They looked at one another nervously, however, when the skinny old servant, upon learning of her assignment, went to J.C. Penney and bought herself a bikini. Chapter 15. The sky is more impersonal than the sea. Above the birdline, higher than the last referential cloud, at an altitude that oxygen while not voluntarily frequent, across a zone where light drives the speed limit and never stops for coffee, crossing that desert in which gravity is the only chic, a vehicle, owned and operated by Northwest Orient Airlines, whistled through its nostrils as it bucked the current of the Pacific jet stream. Lee Cherie turned from the window through which she'd been gazing down upon cloud top and ocean top. Lee Cherie looked at the old woman asleep in the adjacent seat. Lee Cherie had to smile, rippling the canned air of the first-class cabin with her gentle snores. Giulietta was so serene that it was difficult to imagine her causing all the trouble she'd caused back at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport a few hours before. Lee Cherie had been as surprised as anyone by the frog. Although the frog was relatively large and uncommonly green, a distant cousin, at best, of Prince Charming, there had been no hint of its presence in Giulietta's little wicker case. No sign of frog at all until the sudden shriek of the uniformed woman at the security check station. A bit of a row had resulted. "Please, no jokes," said the sign above the checkpoint. "And this must be a joke, mustn't it?" The incident was complicated by the fact that Giulietta could offer no English explanation, that her surname resembled a line from an optometrist's examination chart. Security guards conferred. Giulietta and the princess were searched a second time. Their hand luggage was re-examined. The frog was x-rayed to ascertain that it wasn't some kind of weapon. Could they be positive it wouldn't explode? "It's her pet," said Lee Cherie, who, in fact, had such a dim idea what the frog was doing in the old woman's case that even the memory of a European folk tale couldn't illuminate it. "It's her little pet." Lee Cherie batted her lengthy lashes, breathed in such a way that her round breasts seemed to rotate 12 degrees on their axis, and smiled so broadly that certain tiny mouth muscles, long neglected, struggled painfully to break free. "It's her little pet." Having extracted a promise that Giulietta would keep the amphibian enclosed, it was nestled in damp towels inside her bag. The charmed guards decided to let the two women and their widow pet proceed. Aboard the jetliner, however, moments before takeoff, a different set of guards, accompanied by an official of the airlines, abruptly appeared and demanded the frog. "You can't take a live frog into Hawaii," one of them exclaimed. They were quite agitated. At that point, Lee Cherie recalled her previous visit to the islands. She remembered how adamant they had been about restricting travelers bringing in pets of any kind. She remembered that bringing in fresh fruit or flowers was prohibited. She saw in her mind's eye the Honolulu airport's exhibition of insects, a collection of mounted bugs and beetles that had been discovered aboard visiting aircraft. She remembered that at Paradise Park, the performing parrots and cockatoos had all had their wings clipped, so that they might never escape and breed in the wild. The ecology of the islands was so delicately balanced that the introduction of one new species of mammal, bird, or reptile might throw it into chaos. One non-indigenous plant disease or invading female insect might ruin a billion-dollar business, be it pineapple for eating or palm trees for viewing. Lee Cherie motioned to Giulietta, who was lashing the guards furiously with the vilest invectives in her strange language. Lee Cherie motioned for Giulietta to give up the frog. The crone was unconvinced. She hesitated. The captain, co-pilot, and flight crew had joined the administrator and guards in the first-class cabin. Passengers in coach and economy were in the aisles, peering up front to learn what the commotion was about. One of the guards yanked the wicker case from Giulietta's gnarled hands. The lid flew open. The frog took a tremendous leap. It landed on the head of a stewardess, who sent shocked whispers the length and breadth of the plane by screaming, "Ah! Get that fucking thing off me!" The frog took another leap and came down on an empty seat. Several men dove for it. They missed. Dives and misses continued for a while until the frog was cornered in the cockpit, where a guard captured it, but not before he had slammed his elbow into a navigational instrument, causing a possible malfunction. The device had to be checked and rechecked. All in all, the flight was delayed 1 hour and 46 minutes. Giulietta hadn't flown before. She was confused by the objections of the contents of her luggage. She refused to eat the snack served by the still flustered stewardess. How could Lee Cherie make Giulietta understand the great Hawaiian mongoose reaction? Hawaii once had a rat problem. Then somebody hit up upon a brilliant solution. Import mongooses from India. Mongooses would kill the rats. It worked. Mongooses did kill the rats. Mongooses also killed chickens, young pigs, birds, cats, dogs, and small children. There have been reports of mongooses attacking motorbikes, power lawnmowers, golf carts, and James Michener. In Hawaii now, there are as many mongooses as there once were rats. Hawaii had traded its rat problem for a mongoose problem. Hawaii was determined nothing like that would ever happen again. How could Lee Cherie draw for Giulietta the appropriate analogy between Hawaii's rodents and society at large? Society had a crime problem. It hired cops to attack crime. Now society has a cop problem. The answer, of course, is that Lee Cherie could not draw that parallel at all. That parallel had never occurred to her. It had occurred to Bernard Mickey Wrangle, however. Bernard Mickey Wrangle sat in the economy cabin of the Northwest Orient airliner and pondered the rat mongoose crime cop analogy. Bernard Mickey Wrangle sat in the rear of the aircraft with 7 sticks of dynamite strapped to his body. Bernard Mickey Wrangle was clever. Most likely, he would have successfully boarded the flight to Hawaii with 7 sticks of dynamite strapped to his body under any conditions. Certainly, though, the frog had helped pave his way. The frog, incidentally, was released at a pond near the SeaTac runways. For being close to a busy airport, it was a pleasant pond. It featured lily pads and cattails and fat mosquitoes for lunch. But let's face it, damn it all, it wasn't Waikiki. Chapter 16. The jetliner, missing one small green traveler but carrying a bonus 7 sticks of dynamite, continued its crossing of what every novice surfer knows to be the most inappropriately named body of water on Earth. The jetliner whistled to conceal its fear of gravity. Lee Cherie read magazines to conceal her excitement. Excitement widened in her eyes like the periods at the end of billboard sentences. Commas of excitement wobbled in her tummy, and question marks squirmed in there as well. Every once in a while, she felt as if she were sitting on an exclamation point. Such a wonderful idea was the Geotherapy Care Fest that it was surprising to her that it hadn't happened before. An assembly of the best thinkers, the most advanced technicians, the most concerned scientists, the most enlightened artists, pooling their knowledge and their dreams for the betterment of all. That was what the United Nations would be, were the United Nations not in the hands of the dull and corrupt. were it not in the service of ego politics. At the Maui conference, Buckminster Fuller would deliver a paper on harvesting pollution. "There's gold in them thar spills." Gary Snyder would talk about the Buddhist approach to fighting City Hall. The lecture by the environmentalist Dr. Barry Commoner, his name induced by the princess a twinge of superiority, followed by a deeper twinge of guilt, would be entitled, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." The alternative birth control workshop would be led by Linda Coghill, the woman who single-handedly slashed the illegitimacy and abortion rates in Portland, Oregon. On the morning of February 26th, Lee Sheree would have to choose between a demonstration of the photovoltaic cell, a breakthrough in reducing the expense of solar power, and a panel discussion led by Dr. Linus Pauling on vitamin C as a prevention and a cure. Oh my, this was exciting. Was there any planetary problem of significance that the Carefast overlooked? Lee Sheree couldn't think of one. Maybe Lee Sheree would admit nothing significant in the fact that the articles in the magazines she was perusing were largely about romance. Who was breaking up or taking up with whom, and what to do when husbands lose interest, how to cope with loneliness and rejection, and so forth. The advertisements in the magazines were almost exclusively concerned with making oneself attractive to the opposite sex. The movie that was screened aboard the plane was a love story. Moreover, the movie had an unhappy ending and thus was considered realistic. And when the princess put on a headset to listen to the tape music that Northwest Orient provided its passengers, the songs she heard were about hearts breaking and hearts aching, or hearts quaking as they slid, spewing sparks, across the electrified threshold of new love. Maybe Lee Sheree elected to disregard the evidence because it was just too personal. If beneath the great issues and all-encompassing questions, as underplayed as they were in the last quarter of the 20th century, a more intimate struggle raged, a struggle whose real goal was romantic fulfillment. Maybe it was courageous and honorable to attempt to transcend that struggle, to insist on something more than that. Maybe. In the rear of the aircraft, Bernard Mickey Wrangle reached inside his jacket and pulled from his breast pocket not a detonator nor a fuse, not yet, but a packet of Hostess Twinkies. "Too bad the Queen insisted that you fly first class, Lee Sheree. Too bad you're sitting next to your snoozing old chaperone instead of next to Bernard Mickey Wrangle, since Hostess Twinkies always travel in pairs. Because, like the coyote, the killer whale, the gorilla, and the whooping crane, Hostess Twinkies mate for life. There would have been a Twinkie each for you to share." Chapter 17. The airliner circled Honolulu the way a typing finger circles a keyboard, awaiting the message from the control center that would instruct it when and where to land. And they land on A. Runway A. A for attic. A for amore. What we have here is an unexpected touchdown on the runway of the heart. This flight could only terminate in a room close to the moon. The no smoking sign was on. In the attic, the Camel cigarettes were never to be lit. The signal to fasten seatbelts was given. In Amore, belts fasten and unfasten at delicious intervals. Giulietta clutched her wicker case, which now bore but the slightest spore of frog. Lee Sheree clutched her thighs, as dry now as princess thighs ought to be. Bernard Mickey Wrangle listed on the passenger manifest as T. Victrola Firecracker, but once known to millions as the Woodpecker, clutched nothing, not even his black powder underwear. The woodpecker knew better than to clutch and hold. The woodpecker simply grinned. He grinned because he had reached Hawaii without detection. He grinned because Twinkie Cream always made him grin. He grinned because it was the last quarter of the 20th century and something momentous was happening.